Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, some big stories tonight. We're going to go over Trump's note that he left Biden at the White House. Going to be going over some new updates from Trump. Going to be going into Biden's talk about banning, quote unquote, assault weapons, what that actually means. Some good stories to go into tonight. And good seeing you all, folks. Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone. Yeah, Wanda Drew, good to see you here. Thank you. Here in Maine. Thank you. Gary S., thanks for being here. Liz Kim, thanks for being here. Jared Bradshaw, sup, Josh? Yeah, good seeing y'all. Just a quick update. You might notice my bookshelves are empty. It's because I'm in the process of moving, and so you'll have to forgive me for the time being. Hopefully by Sunday this will be solved and have my new bookshelf all set up again. So hopefully by Sunday the old set will be back together. But for now, I'm in the process of moving, so it's a bit funky looking. Yeah, but good seeing y'all here. Folks, as always, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. And that's it. Let's get started on some stories. So first of all, I want to talk about the letter Trump left for Biden in the White House. All right, so first of all here, this is Epoch Times. It says, former President Donald Trump revealed what he wrote to President Joe Biden when he left office in January. And Trump said during a podcast interview on Monday with Lisa Booth, describing the letter he left to Biden, quote, basically, I wished him luck. And it was a couple of pages long. And it was from the heart because I want to see him do well. Now, Trump doesn't read the whole letter. He doesn't recite the whole letter, but he just says basically he wished him good luck. It's unclear whether Trump meant that in kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of way or if he meant it directly. He continues, though, stating, I want him to do well, but that doesn't include closing up the Keystone Pipeline, which, by the way, environmentally is much better than having crude oil on trains. But Biden's friend and supporter, Warren Buffett, has trains. Nobody ever talks about that, alleging, it seems, that Warren Buffett, a Biden supporter, may have an interest in shutting down the Keystone Pipeline because he may profit from the trains. Now, Biden never made reference to the contents of the letter that Trump left him during interviews in January, but just said it was, quote, very generous. Now, in recent years, outgoing presidents have left letters to their successors. Usually, they leave a note on the Resolute desk, which was given in the United States by Queen Victoria in the 19th century. Now, unclear exactly the contents of what Trump's full letter are. Basically, Trump is saying that he wished Biden good luck, that he wished him well. And he did seem to hope genuinely that Biden may benefit the country and keep in place the different things Trump had put into place. Trump repeatedly said after he left office that he did believe that things would be okay, if Biden kept in place the things that Trump did. But of course, as we saw, Biden very rapidly got rid of almost everything Trump did through executive action, bypassing Congress, signing executive orders to basically undo as rapidly as possible everything Trump put into place. Whether it be, for example, lowering the price of insulin, whether it be building the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, whether it be ending the program that required people applying for asylum coming from Latin America to wait in Mexico, not in the United States. And we're seeing the impacts of that now. Biden got rid of all of it. And again, not clear what the contents of the letter are fully. Trump does seem to verify, though, statements previously that he wished Biden well, wished to see him do well. Now, another point in this, though, that's interesting. I'll continue this. This is also in Monday's interview. Trump suggested that he doesn't miss Twitter, which he used to generate mass amounts of engagement during the 2016 campaign and presidency. And Trump said about his new method of communication, quote, I put out a statement. It's much more elegant than a tweet, and I find it's picked up better. I almost always say better than Twitter. I would almost say better than Twitter. Of course, Trump's new form of communication is quite different than the old one. I don't need to tell you all, but of course, Trump used to favor tweets, including like really early in the morning. I mean, he'd be up very early in the morning writing tweets. And many people, by the time they'd wake up, they'd have several Trump tweets, sometimes pretty pretty, Trump was a fighter, you know what I mean? And he'd go after people. And so he'd call people names, he'd criticize people, he'd go after things, he'd condemn policies, he'd call people out for actions he didn't agree with, and so on. His tweets, of course, generated both laughs if you were a conservative, probably, and a lot of anger if you were more liberal. And it seems to be the case that Trump is saying he doesn't miss it. He doesn't miss Twitter. What he's saying instead now is that he favors this form of using statements, putting out statements. Now, the big difference with statements is that these are not necessarily public. The statements rely on him to be basically picked up by other media. He sends these statements out to media, they publish them, or he sends them out to people on Twitter, they publish them. Using this method, Trump can write more complete statements and communicate more complete ideas. I'd say the big problem with the statements, in my observation, even though Trump, I think, is considered less controversial with them, the problem with the statements is that, well, a lot of people choose to not publish them, and if media chooses to not publish them, the people who read those publications are not going to see them. I would argue that very few people who read New York Times probably sees his statements. And you could say the same thing probably applied almost as true when Trump was using Twitter, and they oftentimes took his tweets out of context. But because of the public way of doing it, where everybody could see it, a lot of people would just go and read them themselves. Trump's Twitter feed had many people from all sides of the political spectrum on there. And so it wasn't, of course, just conservatives or Trump supporters reading Trump's tweets, meaning that the reach of it is much smaller now. Now, at the same time, right? At the same time, Trump has talked about the possibility of starting up his own social media. I'm going to get into that in just a bit, folks. But first, let's talk about our advertiser supporters for today. Now, I've mentioned we are totally demonetized on YouTube currently, trying to get it fixed. Also looking at a few other options, so wait around a little bit. Might have some big announcements soon. But for here, folks, tonight's sponsor is American Hartford Gold. And with all the turbulence with the economy, the stock market, and with risks of inflation, you can consider investing in an asset that's often stable and that has mostly been on the incline. That is gold and silver. Now, American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. Now, to learn more, please check out the link we have in the comments below, where American Hartford Gold is providing a free 25-page information guide. So even if you're not interested in buying gold or silver, you just want to learn about how to invest in gold and silver, check out that information guide they've given us. Find it again in the description below. Now, if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver on all qualifying first orders. The phone number for that is 877-260-2764. Or you can text Joshua to 65532. Now, that said, folks, let's go over a couple questions. Then I want to go into what Trump's doing with this social media, because we talked about this previously. Now, first of all, this is from Mitzi Council. He said, can you please talk about the push for making Washington and D.C. and Puerto Rico into states? We're going to have a country left to save in 2 years. Well, it's actually interesting. So Trump's policy did include potentially making Puerto Rico its own state. And the reason behind that, I was wondering about myself, to be honest. Maybe Trump believed that Puerto Rico, if made into a state, would have voted for him. Hard to say. You might remember, let me explain the big picture first, and I'll go into the details. Now, the Trump policy was to make Puerto Rico its own state. The Democrat policy was to make Washington, D.C., right, the District of Columbia, its own state. D.C. is totally Democrat. They'd vote wholly Democrat, meaning that the Democrats would get Senate seats, 2 more Senate seats probably, and as well as maybe some more House seats. Unclear how much they get from that, as well as some electoral college votes as well, meaning that Democrats would have at least probably gotten maybe 2 more Senate seats out of the deal if they did make Washington, D.C. its own state. Now, the problem we have with that is the ability of making the nation's capital into a state. There is some red tape around that, but them having a supermajority right now, laws don't have the same weight they used to. Let's put it that way. Trump had talked previously about making Puerto Rico its own state, though. You might remember going back to the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. Everyone remember that when he had these hurricanes in Puerto Rico and you had the Trump sending supplies there. Democrats were making a big scandal about it, saying that Trump wasn't delivering supplies. Republicans, conservatives were saying he's delivering supplies that are not being delivered. And anybody who said that was being called a conspiracy theorist, including myself. I was being called a conspiracy theorist for talking about articles and doing interviews of people on the ground saying they weren't getting the supplies. And then it turned out that one of the local politicians was wrapped up in a big corruption scandal because they were hoarding the supplies. Everyone remember that huge corruption scandal that barely got covered when all this stuff fell apart, when the whole narrative fell apart? And it turns out the corrupt politicians in Puerto Rico were hoarding the supplies and making them go bad, and people weren't getting them, so they could use it as bad press against Trump. Well, after that whole thing, Democrats kind of stopped promoting the idea of making Puerto Rico its own state. Whereas for a little bit, they were promoting the idea of making it its own state. It did seem to be the case that maybe people there observing the corruption within their own political system might have leaned more towards Trump. And it is possible that Trump saw that and was interested in making Puerto Rico its own state because he might get, might get more Republican votes out of it. Unclear how that would actually play out, to be honest, because I'm not really sure what the voting demographic in Puerto Rico is. But Democrats did back off it, and Trump did have it in his policy. Now they're promoting it again. Very likely, though, they're promoting it because they're using race narratives. They're using, they use race as a political tool. Race is just for them, it's just a political tool. It doesn't actually mean anything. They are technically the biggest racists in the country. They're total racists. They define everything according to race. They believe in segregation. They believe in identifying people according to the color of their skin. They believe in pre-labeling crimes as being race-based before anything comes out on them. And they use race to gain political power. That is the entire race narrative in a nutshell. Don't take it for anything beyond that, in my opinion. It's just politics, right? It's Maoism. That was the whole Maoist strategy. Really, if you get down to it, these are folks who support really. I've said previously, socialism is the ideology of hatred, and socialism is the ideology of slavery. If people really wanted to cancel racism, they'd cancel Marx, because frankly, the most destructive force culturally in terms of eliminating local cultures was socialism and communism. If you look at the way that it destroyed cultures all around the world, what it did to Africa, what it did to Latin America, what it did to China, that was Marxism in practice. If you want to cancel racism, cancel Marxism. If you want to get rid of a system that killed 100 million people and counting in many parts of the world, some put it up to 150 million, cancel Marx. And Marx, by the way, was a real racist, serious racist. And so it's a bunch of nonsense. These are people who promote hatred because they believe in the idea of the struggle of opposites. And they believe that by inciting struggle, which was part of the whole idea of Marxism, right? So the struggle of opposites, that they can advance the dialectic. That was the whole idea, the struggle of opposites, right? They believe in inciting hatred. That is the basis of it, right? Make people hate each other, move things forward through the struggle of opposites. Now let's get into the next question. This is from Zoe S. He said, Josh, thank you for your interview with the two guys that made the movie God's Not Dead. It was powerful and true message to Christians and America. I appreciate it. Yeah, folks, if you haven't checked out the interview we published, please check it out. I interviewed the two filmmakers of God's Not Dead and of Unplanned. And I think you'll find it interesting. It's talking about the creation of the new Hollywood. And they talk as well about some of the things that are wrong with Hollywood, including some pretty dark stuff. They don't detail all of it, but they said there's some dark stuff going on in Hollywood. And you have people breaking off from it right now and trying to start up an independent Hollywood. And these guys validated that it can be done, that you can be successful. You can make successful films outside the institution of Hollywood. All right, folks, let's go into a few more stories, and I'll jump into some more questions. Again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Now, first of all, I'm going to go over Epoch Times again, talking about what Trump has been saying. It's Epoch Times reporting. Trump declines to confirm reports about social media comeback. Remember, we reported on this previously. I'll explain this just a bit. It says here, former President Donald Trump declined to confirm rumors that he is planning a social media comeback with his own platform, but indicated that emailing press releases has been an effective strategy in getting his message out so far. And Trump said in an interview with Greg Kelly on Newsmax, quote, he said, "We have a lot of options and something will happen with social media if I want it to happen." Now, this comes after Trump's senior advisor, Jason Miller, told Fox News on Sunday that he expects Trump will, quote, return to social media in 2 or 3 months with, quote, his own platform. And he said this will, quote, completely redefine the game and, quote, attract, quote, tens of millions of users. But Miller, during the interview, did not elaborate on the details of such a platform. Last month, Trump confirmed that negotiations were underway on his future social media plans, which could see the former president joining an existing platform or set up his own. Now, where are things with this? Let's go into a few different points on that. Now, Trump's just not confirming it. One of his senior advisors, again, Jason Miller, said that Trump is doing this. This is often the way Trump works. He won't, he likes to keep the drama. He likes to keep the expectations going, because as long as there's drama, people are paying attention to it. If you were to announce it, that initial, boom that gets people moving, you lose it. Trump knows typically how to use these things to his advantage. I would say that Trump is avoiding saying it directly because he wants to maintain maximum impact for when he does announce it, which is going to get a lot more press coverage. He did the same thing during CPAC, where he didn't really say he was going to run for president again in 2024, but in other words, as a reporter, I could not say Trump said he will run for president in 2024. I could not say that. But the way that he stated it, he pretty much said that. And that's how he works. He played around with words, right? He messed with people a little bit. But he said it in such a way that if you watch his statement, he pretty much said that he's going to run for president again in 2024. He's doing the same thing now with this whole social media thing, right? He's saying that, he hasn't decided yet. We'll have to see what he does. He's using press releases right now, and he's emailing them out, doing things like that, sending them to media. He's going to make his return. I mentioned before, he's going to need a place to organize. He's doing this whole grassroots movement, working on this, right? Now, a few interesting points on this, though. Trump did confirm that negotiations are underway on his future social media plans. In other words, he is planning a return to social media. The big question is, how will he make his return? Again, Jason Miller said, according to telling Fox News, one of Trump's senior advisors, that Trump is going to be launching his own social media within a couple months. Outside of that, Trump only has a couple options, neither of which is really has everything he would need anyways. The two options are Parler or Gab, pretty much. There's a few others, but really those are the main ones in terms of what's already out there. Gab, I'd love to see it. Doesn't have as much weight as Parler does currently, and Parler is kind of reeling right now because the former CEO just filed a law, or just announced he's going to be suing them, and so Parler may be in some hot water. Mr. Mates is now suing them because you might remember the Parler board or whatever removed him as CEO, and so Parler's not doing so hot, meaning that we'll have to see what happens with Trump. Right? Maybe Trump's going to announce his own. Maybe Trump's going to go to Gab. I doubt that would happen personally. I really think Trump is going to create his own. Gab, one of the reasons I say he wouldn't go to Gab is because Gab already has kind of a pigeonholed identity. It's very closely associated, just in terms of branding and so on, with the alt-right type image, and I don't think it would serve him much use going there personally, other than just having an extra platform to speak on. I don't think he would use it personally. Folks asking, I actually do have a Gab account. I'm not active on there though. Yeah, but again, in my opinion, it would make sense if Trump created his own platform, or maybe found a minor platform that he thinks is usable, gets on there, validates that, people jump to it, and then after making that initial wave, guiding people, directing people to the platform he wants them on, then he can start up other accounts on other social media again and have those be the supporting accounts. I would imagine it's going to be something like that. Again, my analysis. We'll have to see what happens. Now, another story here. This is Trump again. He's saying America no longer has a free press. And Epoch Times reports, former President Donald Trump, in an interview, decried the media landscape in the United States, saying it no longer has a free press. Using the current border crisis as an example of the lack of proper coverage, Trump said, "This is not a free press," during an interview with Lisa Booth's podcast on March 22nd. And Trump said, "This is a press that we have to be very, very very smart to get around. But they don't cover bad things if it happens to be bad for Democrats." It's pretty amazing. You take a look at some of the coverage and some of the travesty that's taking place at the border, and the coverage is not commensurate, he said. If you look at NBC, ABC, CBS, and of course CNN and MSNBC and C, if you look at some of those networks, it's just not covered. It's covered so little, it's amazing. And it's a massive story because it's going to destroy our country. Now, those of you who've been following this, you now have another border crisis, one which the Biden administration is pouring billions of dollars into. Because Biden stopped the construction of the border wall, they're claiming they're trying to stop the flow of people coming illegally into the country while offering them free money through stimulus packages, free health care, and offering them free hotel rooms or other places to stay. And right, it's not looking so hot. Basically, Project Veritas, you might have seen just yesterday, released exclusive undercover photos showing what the environment looks like within these, child cages, kids in cages type things. And basically you have people packed in like sardines with these, tinfoil weatherproof blankets, tinfoil looking weatherproof blankets. And it looks really bad. It looks worse than the kids in cages, pictures that Trump was blamed for, which ironically came from the Obama administration, which caused scandals across the country, which actually probably got a lot of people voting for Biden over Trump, even though it was technically under the Obama administration, under which Biden was vice president. And people were enraged about it, right? Remember the kids in cages narrative? It turns out the first photo they used of a kid in a cage turned out to be from a protest. It wasn't even a holding cell. And then they used these other photos. It turned out to, again, the other photos turned out to have been from the Obama administration. And then it turned out that, remember AOC went there and collapsed, crying, holding the fence. And it turned out that she was looking at a parking lot. Remember that whole scandal? Well, folks, it turns out that the images were fake. The scandal was fake. The photos of the actual holding facilities Trump was using were so nice looking that they even used them when they tried to shift the narrative and claim that they were Biden's holding facilities because they looked nicer, right? And then it turns out that the real photos of the Biden administration holding facilities look pretty dang terrible. Not only that, but if the reports are true and you have between 10 and 50% of the people coming across the border illegally having the virus, and while the Biden administration is offering them even free health care, as are many sanctuary cities in the U.S., putting people packed together like that, right next to each other, close proximity, more than I think 1,000% capacity, way, way over capacity. This is like the worst type of incubation, scenario for a virus you could possibly make. Again, if you or I were to travel internationally, we would have to, some places you'd have to have a virus passport. You'd have to, have gotten gotten the vaccine and shown them your virus passport. At the very least, a lot of places will make you quarantine, including for coming to New York. These people are not being forced to do a lot of this. And so it's pretty concerning. If they actually do believe that the virus is serious enough, as they claim, to justify lockdowns, to justify mask mandates, to justify maybe even forcing people to take the vaccines, or making people get vaccinated if they want to, attend events like they are in New York currently, then why are they allowing this, right? I've mentioned before, what they're really doing right now is they're replicating the same scenario that Cuomo in New York used to kill people in senior homes, these group homes, where they took people who had the virus and they put them together with people in close proximity in these group homes, right? It's like they're Cuomoing the entire country right now using this method, putting people together in these close proximity, very tight holding facilities. Again, so I've read 1,000% over capacity, 50% of whom allegedly have the virus. You can only imagine if the virus is as serious as they claim it is, that people would be in that proximity to each other, possibly giving each other the virus and then releasing them into the United States. It seems like the worst idea possible. But the media, as Trump notes, is not really reporting this. They're choosing to ignore it, which is ironic because they claim to have cared about these things, right? They claim to have cared about social distancing. They claim to have cared about international travel and COVID lockdowns. They claim to have cared about all these things. They claim to care about kids in cages. They obviously don't seem to care about any of this. The big question is, if they don't really care about this, then why are they promoting these things, right? If they cared about them so much, why are they not criticizing them the same right now as they did previously? Why are they doing that, right? Real quick, S. Lample, you make a good point. He said Mike Lindell is starting a social media platform. My guess is that is where he'll return. That's actually possible. That's actually a pretty plausible idea. Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, he did announce that he's starting a social media. Maybe he's working with Trump. They are pretty close to each other. That's plausible. Can't confirm it. It's analysis, but that is plausible. I could see that. Yeah. All right, folks, that said, let's go into a few other stories and I'll go into some more questions. So again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. Now, you might have seen the stories. There was, of course, 2 more mass shootings in the United States. The first of which they tried blaming on white supremacists. Turns out the guy appeared to have been a Biden supporter, incel-looking guy. They claimed that it was done as a hate crime against Asians. He said it wasn't about that. He apparently had a sex addiction and might have shot up. It was an Asian massage parlor. I'm not sure the nature of that one, but in New York, quite a lot of those are actually for prostitution. In fact, it's disgusting in New York. It's done in the open. You can walk around some parts of New York. They're doing it in the open. But again, the narrative is falling apart, right? Narrative's falling apart. And so they're starting to move away from the idea that maybe this guy was a Trump supporter because he was an anti-Trumper. But they're still promoting the idea of, the Asian hate crime narrative, which I'll get into a bit more. And then, of course, you had another mass shooting, which people were saying, oh, I bet he was, you watch the Twitter comments, people are saying, I bet he was white, only white people do this. They started dropping the narrative, and it turns out the guy has an Islamic name. But Biden's now using that to call for an assault weapon ban in the United States. Let's get into this. Now, Epoch Times reports President Joe Biden on Tuesday called for a ban on, quote, assault weapons. Assault weapons. It's not really a category, but it's one thing they like to use because it sounds scary. A ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines following a shooting at a Colorado supermarket that reportedly left at least 10 people dead on Monday, and a separate shooting at an Atlanta area spa left 8 dead last week. Gun rights groups have warned that Democratic lawmakers' bills could potentially turn millions of law-abiding gun owners into criminals. And Biden said this: we can ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in this country once again. I got that done when I was a senator. I passed. It was the law for the longest time, and it brought down these mass killings. Did it really? He said we should do it again. Now, he did not elaborate on what an assault weapon would be, because the definition of assault weapon it's a political term, right? It's not an actual type of weapon. It's a political term. People point to AR-15s. AR does not mean assault weapon, assault rifle. That's just political jargon because they think it sounds scary, right? There's no category for what defines that technically, right? Biden said at the White House, though, that he didn't elaborate on an assault weapon is, but again, high capacity magazines typically refer to a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds. These are political terms, right? High capacity magazine and assault weapon, meaning that Biden is seemingly pushing to move forward with this ban on rifles, long guns. Now, it's unclear exactly how broad that will be. And it's unclear as well whether it can get passed. The Democrats in Congress are already moving forward to do this. Pelosi's gotten behind it. And you have, of course, Democrat politicians in the House already pushing forward with some legislation on this. Biden has also suggested, according to some media reports, that he might be able to use executive action for it. We'll have to see how this goes. Now, a couple points with this. If Biden were to actually ban categories of firearms, and the question is, how do you actually enforce it? A lot of sheriff's departments across the United States have announced previously they would not enforce a law like this. First of all, because it goes against the Constitution, it would violate the Constitution. And many law enforcement officers in the United States are sworn to protect the Constitution. Doing so would actually go against their oaths. And ironically, a lot of politicians as well are sworn to protect the Constitution, but they don't uphold it always. At the same time, a lot of them will not enforce it because it would be putting their own lives in danger. One of the few things that a lot of Americans said that they would fight over, if it came down to it, would be their right to bear arms. And to have police officers sent to people's homes to seize their weapons when they have the legal constitutional rights to have them, just because a politician comes in a few months and decides that people can't have things that are protected in the Constitution anymore, well, they'd be putting their own lives at risk. And so we'll have to see if they can enforce it. What's been floated are a few different things, though, previously, because it's been tossed around real quick. School of the World, he said AR means arm a light. Yeah, it's a brand. Doesn't mean assault rifle. It's a brand, right? Anyways, getting into it, they have talked briefly a little bit about what this possible ban, quote unquote, may look like. Some of it has suggested that it would not be an actual ban on people who already currently own rifles, long guns, that it would instead be the case that people who currently have them would be able to grandfather them in. And what they would do instead is try to forbid people from manufacturing them through removing legal protections. So if you manufacture rifles, you could be held legally liable if people use those guns for crimes. And the risk to people of that is pretty serious. You can imagine a lot of manufacturers would stop manufacturing them. It's what they did to the cigarette industry. It's what they did to the tobacco industry. They made it so people could sue them. Now we'll have to see how that plays out. And then they could use taxes, of course, or have like a make like a gun owner's tax, for example. They've talked about these things where if you want to own a firearm, you're gonna have to pay a huge amount of money to keep it. Maybe have a license that has to be renewed every year that costs a grip of money. It could be things like this, which would be kind of ironic in some ways because it would become a class thing at that point. I'm sure people could use that. Only the rich elites can own firearms, right? But at the same time, keep in mind, these are the politicians who've surrounded their own offices with armed guards. These are the same politicians who don't trust the American people enough to tear down the fences around Washington. They're starting to a little bit, but not around all the areas. Who want to have the National Guard armed with the same type of weapons they want to ban because they don't trust the American people. And they expect the American people to trust them, in ways that they don't trust us back. Quite the bizarre situation. And at the same time, too, you could argue, maybe if they want to ban them, let them do it first. Let the politicians get rid of their armed guards first, and let the politicians send home the National Guard first. If they believe that firearms are not necessary for protection, they can call the police. Why do we have the police, right? If they feel that they need a gun there, they can call a police officer and they can show up and protect them, just like we can, right? What do they need guns for all around them, right? Tongue in cheek, of course. So, same reason most Americans need guns is because typically police respond to crimes, not try to predict things about to happen, meaning that typically if you need a firearm in your own home or something like that, it's too late. And keep in mind, too, the reason the founding fathers of the United States who framed the Constitution wanted Americans to be able to have firearms was to allow them to protect themselves against tyrannical government. It was not about hunting deer or something like this. Maybe partly, right? The idea was to make sure that you had a well-armed, well-trained, and prepared militia to deal with threats from the government itself. The idea was about keeping government in check, meaning that, of course, the very reason people would need firearms is not about, keeping burglars out of their house or hunting deer, which is of course part of it, but instead to keep the government in check. Now, this said, there are some states, in addition to possibly police in different states not enforcing these laws if they do try to pass them. There are different states that have talked about forming gun sanctuary cities. Arizona, for example, is talking about it. Others are talking about it. And so you're going to see a lot of different states push back against this. And as the federal government continues to violate the Constitution repeatedly, you can expect a lot of states to push back through local law to make sure that the Constitution is not violated. That said, let's go into a few more stories. One more, and then I'll go into some questions. Now, speaking of the fences around the U.S. Capitol, there's now evidence, according to the Biden administration, that the U.S. Capitol breach could support sedition charges, according to a federal prosecutor. Let's go into this. It says here, Epoch Times reports, evidence that federal investigators have collected during their criminal probe into the January 6th breach of the U.S. Capitol could result in sedition charges. The federal prosecutor who is leading the investigation said in a recent interview. Michael Sherwin, former acting U.S. attorney in Washington, told CBS News, 60 Minutes, that the evidence obtained by federal investigators so far would likely allow the federal government to prove cases of sedition against some individuals. Under federal law, sedition includes a conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government or to oppose the authority by force or prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. These charges carry a penalty of up to 20 years imprisonment. And he said, Sherwin said, quote, I personally believe the evidence is trending toward that and probably meets these elements. I believe the facts do support those charges, and I think that as we go forward, more facts will support that. Now, folks, if sedition in this case is considered opposing authority by force, that's one thing. But preventing or hindering or delaying the execution of any law of the United States. If they say that delaying any law of the United States would constitute sedition, that's a pretty broad charge if used for this purpose. You could argue, for example, that maybe politicians launching a filibuster to delay the execution of a law could fall into that category if they want to use it to a more extreme form. You could argue, for example, that maybe them hindering the dueling electors on the other side from 7 states, that the dueling electors, maybe, for example, preventing them from entering the building to cast their dueling votes, that in itself could have been sedition. But no, you're probably not going to hear that side of it. What you're hearing instead is the act of individuals who entered the U.S. Capitol building on January 6th, delaying the electoral college votes, the counting of the electoral college votes. Now, the Biden administration has talked about 3 categories of people who were protesting on that day, January 6th. They said basically there were your peaceful protesters, the overwhelming majority of them. There were some people who got kind of caught up in the moment, entered the Capitol building, maybe took some selfies inside the Capitol building. And then they claimed there were people who went there with intention to actually do damage or overthrow things or whatever. None of them had firearms. There's no reports of firearms yet. The most they found is people had, like, in their cars, wherever else in the city, firearms, but nobody who actually entered the building had firearms. You did have individuals tied to Antifa and to Black Lives Matter there who have been charged, but not on that, it seems yet, who talked about on social media their intention of doing things exactly like this. We'll have to see if they actually face charges for it. It does seem to be the case the main people they're going after currently with these types of charges are the Proud Boys and the 3%, not the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers. It seems to be the case that these are the two main groups they're targeting with this. I did speak to a source about this who's with the Biden administration on this, claim that they have something like 30 different law enforcement / military departments doing a big investigation into this. The content of it sounds a bit bizarre, though. This individual told me that one of the things they're working on currently is they're looking at, for example, Freedom Forever, you're clarifying 3%ers are the Oath Keepers. Thank you for clarifying. One thing I've heard from an individual working on some of these cases is that one of the things they're looking into are, for example, the lawyers these individuals are hiring. And they're looking, for example, into foreign financing of the lawyers because they claim Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, they're getting lawyers that cost like $700, $800 an hour. And these are not people who normally have the ability to hire lawyers. Question I proposed to him was, well, doesn't that violate the law? Because there's protections between attorneys and clients. There's protections on that. He came back and said it doesn't violate the law if there's crimes involved with the payments themselves, which they have no evidence of currently. And so, in other words, they're launching pre-crime investigations. It seems to be the case. They're launching investigations of a crime they think may have happened, but without any evidence on which to launch that investigation into a possible crime, which is quite bizarre when you think about it, right? Violating possible attorney-client privileges in order to launch investigations into foreign financing. They do claim, however, that some financing does come from Belgium, and they're alleging that it might come from political groups within Belgium who do have ties to like actual Nazi parties. And so they'll very likely try to use that if they can find any evidence on it to claim that it's a race issue. We'll have to see what comes out from this. I will give you more information if I can get more information. But again, folks, it seems this is what's very likely going to happen with this. If they can charge Proud Boys and charge the 3%ers, Oath Keepers, with sedition, and allege as well that these individuals have foreign financing tied to, actual neo-Nazi groups, which they are currently investigating. You're going to have a few different things on this. One is going to be, of course, the argument of legality of the types of investigations doing in the first place, but very likely most media won't focus on that. Instead, what they'll focus on is probably trying to pin this on Trump, right? They'll try to pin it on Trump and say, look, Trump incited sedition. And if they can say that Trump incited sedition, they can try to push back on the entire movement Trump's trying to push right now to overturn the House and the Senate back to Republicans by 2022. And it seems to be the case that this is what they're using these investigations for. This is a deeply politicized case. It does seem, and again, with dueling narratives, because it doesn't seem they're treating the Antifa and BLM folks who were there with the same type of scrutiny. And the media is ignoring that side of it while promoting this whole white nationalist narrative, while at the same time doing purges internally of military, police, and so on, based on ideology, and trying to frame any kind of pro-Trump ideology as being some kind of extremist thing. Yeah, they're doing all these things currently. And, I'll be following this as it develops. So, again, as new information comes out, I'll keep you all updated on this. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into a few questions. Yeah. Again, folks, I don't have super chat anymore. So if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. And the super chat, it's a bit funky. I know one of the problems you have with super chat is that it kind of prioritizes, of course, people who donate. But at the same time, it makes it easy to keep track of questions. It's actually really hard to keep track of questions without it. So if you did have questions, leave them in the chat now. This is from Monica Morris. He said, Josh, aren't some states firearm sanctuaries? There are some states working on it. You might watch the interviews I did at CPAC. I did interview one of the representatives, I believe, in Arizona. And they're talking about making Arizona a firearm sanctuary state. And the irony of it is that they're planning to use the same sanctuary state models that the Democrats used during the Trump administration to allow illegal aliens to not be deported for crimes. Because again, typically it's hard to deport people just generally. But if illegal immigrants in the United States commit crimes and they are prosecuted and have to go through the court system, typically the police will communicate with ICE, immigration enforcement, and they'll deport them. The sanctuary city laws made it so that the police could not communicate with ICE. And so people even convicted of crimes, and these were all the ones related to crimes, were not being deported. And so you had actual criminals being protected by local governments through sanctuary city laws. That was the nature of that. The irony of that is that the Trump administration, the irony of that is now that the more conservative states are using that exact same model in some places, and they're talking about it, Arizona being one of them, to create gun sanctuary cities. And basically the way they can do it is the same way that they did the normal sanctuary city rules, which is essentially making it so that police are forbidden. They can word it in a certain way that it would encompass that police are forbidden, for example, from, enforcing laws that would violate, for example, Second Amendment protections, even if it's federal law. It's the same kind of stuff they did even with, decriminalizing marijuana, even though it was still legal under federal law, for example. They could decriminalize it on the local level and make it so that it would override the ability of the federal government to enforce it. Not to say that federal agents like the FBI couldn't do stuff about it, but it prevents local law enforcement from doing something about it. And so you do have states already putting stuff like that into place. We'll have to see how that plays out. Again, folks, you have questions, leave them in the chat. This is from Blue AM. He said, question, what is the deal with Cindy Powell and her saying no reasonable person would believe what she said to be facts? I apologize, but I don't know the context of this. If you're talking about her allegations of election fraud, because when it first came out, she was making some pretty strong statements, some of which it's not clear whether they were true or not. I do have some background information on what was taking place. Now, again, going back to the time of the election, you had Cindy Powell, Lynn Wood, and the Trump team making most of the lawsuits around election fraud. There's some independent lawsuits as well. The main ones were coming from Cindy Powell, Trump's team, and from Lynn Wood. Now, you might remember there was a bit of a falling out between the Trump team and Cindy Powell. And Cindy Powell was making some very strong statements. Some of them maybe shouldn't have the ability to back them up. I did, of course, have sources close to them. I was doing stories on it back at the time. The story I heard from people who were close to this, was basically that they were getting a lot of allegations, right? Basically, they had to put together an entire case and based on claims people were making, and then go and try to verify the claims people were making. Again, they had something like over 1,000 sworn testimonies of people swearing under oath their allegations. The problem they had, however, according to the people I spoke with, was they were getting a lot of false claims. And it seemed to have been the case that there was a big campaign of people doing that, people contacting them with false allegations, which led them down, roads of inquiry that yielded nothing, or that would work as basically traps to ensure that if they did report it, they reported false news. I was told by these individuals that one of the cases they investigated was the allegation of, for example, ballots being flown in from South Korea. They had teams actually go there, investigate it. Turned out the thing was not as they said it was. And so they wasted a whole lot of time, a whole lot of manpower, and unfortunately maybe made some false statements publicly, which, ended up defaming or ended up taking away credibility of their legitimate cases because of that. Now, if you get into the realms of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, we would categorize this as misinformation. In other words, the use of actual false information. And misinformation has its strategic uses when you get into things like this, politics, spy type stuff, whatever, right? Misinformation is the intentional seeding of false information to derail, in this case, legitimate inquiry, to, take people who are working on legitimate investigations and send them down dead ends of research, to, corner them or trick them into making false statements, to divide them internally, as happened with Cindy Powell and the Trump legal team, or, for example, waste their time when time is of the essence, as it was in this case. And by seeding false information to them, you had individuals who made false statements and were, basically people went after them for making false statements, which took away from the actual true stories that were being told and the actual, more than 1,000 sworn witnesses, sworn testimony that really should have been looked at. And so it seems to be the case that Cindy Powell is saying that I haven't actually read her statement saying this, but if she is saying that, I would assume that she's referring to some of her allegations in the early days, suggesting what they were hearing, and that she's maybe suggesting that not all categories of inquiry yielded something. She might be suggesting that. From ZC, said, Josh, have you seen the interview with Jeremy Brown from Gateway Pundit? He goes into detail about being an oath keeper, the Federal Bureau of Investigation on January 6th. I'm not sure if that's. I might have seen that article. I did see an article. I believe it was Gateway Pundit, where you had an individual who was a Green Beret, and the FBI, it seemed, approached him to try to get him to infiltrate the Oath Keepers, to act as a double agent, essentially, or a spy, basically recruited by the FBI to infiltrate them and work as an informant. I actually considered including that story in tonight's articles. I didn't, because that's kind of like typical FBI behavior. They will typically, one of the big jokes with a lot of these militias is that, people joke that maybe half the people in there are federal agents anyways. To the extent sometimes that you have multiple branches of government, multiple agencies having agents in there, and maybe they're just investigating each other to some extent. Oath Keepers, I'd say, are of the militias probably among the more legitimate ones, I would assume, based on what I've seen of them. But yes, I did see the story talking about that side of it, that basically FBI seemed to have tried to recruit someone, a former Green Beret, to infiltrate or become a member of the Oath Keepers with the intent of working as a government spy within their ranks. They were doing that. This is typical behavior of FBI, though. You could assume that they already have people. I would assume they already have people in there. I'd be surprised if they didn't. Which actually does raise some of the concerns that people have raised previously, which is that during the January 6th protests, you did have people arrested who were with these organizations who appeared to have been, for example, agents of different departments. The big question is, were those people actual protesters, or were they federal agents working as part of an infiltration op? And were they let off, arrested but let off as part of the op? Typically, the way that the federal investigators will work is that they'll have to arrest their own guys, right? They will have to arrest their own guys as part of the operation to ensure that their guys are not outed as being the ones who weren't arrested, and then they'll give them maybe bargains if there is a prosecution or something, right? You have all kinds of funky things like this. Not clear whether that's the case, but you do have a case here now. This former Green Beret, talking about how they did approach him to do this. Not quite clear what's going on, but we do know that the FBI, well, I think what I've been told, more than 30 departments investigating this, including like the Coast Guard, which I've been told, including like the Coast Guard, which is technically law enforcement except in wartime, where it's considered military. What I've been told, though, is the whole investigation is kind of a mess right now, because you have 30-something departments trying to, co-investigate something. They're going down tracks of research that may not yield anything and may be illegal even in practice, because you're possibly violating attorney-client protections, right? Unless they can prove that something's illegal, but it's a fishing expedition to this point, because they're violating the law within an attempt to find violations of the law. And so it's a mess. And what I've been told, individual working on this, is that basically, even within the teams investigating it, they can't see eye to eye. You're having all kinds of infighting, and they can't agree on things. It's a mess, from what I've been told. But we'll have to see what happens, because you do have a deeply politicized system right now. You do have a deeply politicized investigation. And, well, folks who are interested in making sure that people don't protest against them, protest against the. I won't get into it. You know, I mentioned before a few times, right? There's this saying, none dare call it treason, right? That if treason does take place, none dare call it treason, right? And why is this? It's because, pretty much, if there was treason, if there was an act of treason, and it's off again. Okay. Sorry, folks. My internet's been funny. I thought my video cut out again. Right. All right. Let's go over one more story. Yeah, video cut out briefly, but I think we're back on now. So strange. It's been doing this to us almost every night. Again, folks, I'm in the process of moving. Hopefully, by the time it clears up, we won't have these problems anymore. It's very strange. It's been happening. I'll do one more story and then we'll call it a night because it's getting a bit late. But I want to talk about some stuff that's happening with China. I'm going to skip ahead one that I wanted to talk about because there's one big story I want to go into, which China's plan for the United States, where things are going right now. Epoch Times reports this. County secretary reveals Xi Jinping's true intentions towards U.S. Xi Jinping is again the head of the Chinese Communist Party. It says on February 25th, Chilean News, the county's official news website run by the propaganda department of Chilean County Party Committee, published a speech by CCP County Committee Secretary He Bin. In his speech, Bin said that he has, quote, studied carefully the important speech of General Secretary Xi Jinping and the spirit of the 5th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee, word by word, sentence by sentence, from beginning to end. Meaning one of the big speeches and meetings the Chinese Communist Party just had. And Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, said this, quote, "The strong West and weak East is history. The East is rising and the West is declining." And he added that Xi said, quote, "The biggest source of chaos in the world nowadays is the United States." And he continues, "The United States is the biggest threat to our country's development and security." Now, I'll go into this just a bit and then I'll explain it a bit. These sentiments that, quote, "the strong West and weak East is history," and the, quote, "East is rising and the West is declining," originated with Mao Zedong. It came from a speech, "The East wind prevails over the West wind." And Xi appears to be quite influenced by Mao. He still believes that the United States is bound to fail and that the CCP will sooner or later replace it. Xi even directly said that the United States is China's biggest threat and that he wants to challenge it. The article also revealed that Xi, quote, when talking about the governance system, made the directional judgment that, quote, "economic globalization will continue to undergo profound changes, but the fundamental direction will not change," and that, quote, "crisis and opportunity coexist. There are opportunities in crisis, and crisis can be turned into opportunity." What does this mean? The Chinese Communist Party is looking to use the crisis of the virus, which they've announced previously, including letters to all communist organizations across the United States last year, telling them to use the virus as an opportunity politically. And that they're talking about the economic situation as well, the economic fallout. Now, as we speak, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to create the system for governments to bounce back from the virus using the China model. China model is what they call state capitalism, which is another word for socialism. In other words, the state controls the systems of capitalism, right? Seize the means of production. If the state controls the systems of capitalism, the state controls the businesses, and that's what the CCP is doing currently. State capitalism sounds less frightening to people who believe in capitalism, right? Just another word for it. Now, what they're talking about in China right now is a mixed model economy, right? Technically fascism-ish. The same thing they did during under the Nazis. What they're talking about, though, is having the government partly own every business. Mixed model economy. Now, the CCP is using that as the model to bounce back from the virus, and this is the model they're going to be promoting internationally. That alongside a digital currency managed by the Chinese central bank. And so what they're doing is creating a digital currency that will allow the Chinese Communist Party to monitor, manage, and restrict or approve every single payment done in the country. Meaning that if the CCP can sanction someone, which they're doing right now internationally, using the court system to go after people who even criticize human rights abuses in China, including they just went after some people with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for their criticism of the Chinese Communist Party's genocide against the Uyghurs. That they can use this system to restrict this, to sanction these individuals, which means that if the CCP can validate this global digital currency, or if other banks get involved with the CCP on this, that your ability to even make purchases can be basically ended by the CCP. Because again, it's one thing to have dollars, in your bank account affected, because you can still technically get hard cash and still work with it. It's another thing if all payments are digital. And the CCP is promoting these new systems as the new international order and as the model for countries to bounce back from the virus. And the way they're looking at the US right now is that the US is in decline. The Chinese Communist Party believes that America is on the decline. They believe it has fallen into chaos. And they're planning on using the current situation with the United States being less engaged and, focused internally on its own problems, doing white supremacist purges within the military rather than focusing on military readiness, and having debates around gender equality within the military rather than try to push back against the Chinese Communist Party and focus on war fighting. Something that Trump had changed within the military, right? Remember, he got rid of a lot of these things and told them to focus on war fighting, removing the politics from it. The CCP views this as a weakness, and they're planning to take advantage of this weakness in their own statements currently. And so while the U.S. is busy fighting itself, while the government is busy going after things like gender equality or whatever else they're trying to go after in the military, the Chinese Communist Party is publicly, in its own words, on the surface stating they're planning to use this to their advantage. And they're saying that the falling of the U.S. into chaos is an advantage for the CCP to rise. They are planning to use this. Xi Jinping himself is stating this, the head of the Chinese Communist Party. And so while our politicians try to tear apart the American system and go after Americans and try to label Americans through whatever label they're pushing, the Chinese Communist Party is planning to utilize the current situation to its own advantage and replace the United States as the world leader, in their own words. Now, folks, that said, I'll be covering this as it develops, covering this as it goes forward, keep you all updated on it. A lot going on right now. And again, we'll have to see how things develop with all these issues, how it develops, for example, with what's happening with different states right now, hardening the election systems. There's been a lot of updates on it that I want to go over still. There's a lot of updates coming out hopefully soon about social media and where things are going. You now have Parler facing lawsuits, Facebook facing massive lawsuits. You have Twitter facing lawsuits. You have Trump talking about launching his own social network. The whole system is about to be really shaken up. A lot of stuff going on in the country right now. And folks, I'll be covering this as we go forward. So again, I'll be doing these live Q&As Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. That said, folks, I'll be back again on Thursday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And of course, in the meantime, be sure to check out the different interviews we're publishing, especially check out the one we just did on Hollywood. I think you'll all really like it. We have some great stuff coming out, so please stay tuned. Check out what we're publishing. I don't think people are getting alerts. If you've clicked the notification bell on YouTube, I don't think they give you alerts. So, every night we're having something different, so be sure to check in. Now, folks, as always, again, we've been demonetized, so on, but it still actually does really help us if you like and subscribe, and if you could tell a friend about Crossroads, because really it's on grassroots folks like you to help people know about this. We are being pretty badly censored right now, so really would appreciate if you do like and subscribe. And of course, folks, that said, again, I'll see you 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday. And check out our interviews tomorrow. We're going to have some up. And as always, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.